All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 10, Section 2, The Rise of American Democracy. So last section, 10.1, recall the corrupt bargain. The corrupt bargain was the deal between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams to essentially steal the presidential election from Andrew Jackson. And you see it illustrated in this picture. This is Henry Clay right here, and he was sewing the mouth shut of Andrew Jackson. Jackson's supporters felt that he had been cheated out of that election, and for the next 8 years, really organize a political force behind him. And this eventually comes to a head in the election of 1828. During that election, Jacksonian support or support for Andrew Jackson championed him as the common man. Slogans like Adams who could write, Jackson who could fight, these were political slogans really used by Jackson supporters to go out and get people's votes. And there was a large amount of popular support for Jackson. They portrayed Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams as the elite. You know, recall the support that Quincy Adams and Henry Clay had for the American system. The American system was support for things like tariffs, banks, business deals, infrastructure, etc., etc. From the perspective of common Americans, the American system, Adams, Clay, the corrupt bargain, all of these things represented a corrupt, closed, elite institution. One way of thinking about it is that the American system, from the point of view of the common man, really represents the interest of business, because you have things like tariffs, which help businesses. You have banking, like the Second National Bank, and politics, right? And when you think about these three kind of factors, right? Business, banking, and politics, they're essentially just all, giving cash to one another. And who's getting left out of this equation? Well, it's the common man, right? And so it's really the quote-unquote common man that comes to support Jackson, even giving him nicknames like Old Hickory. And this made Jackson much more relatable than previous presidents like, Washington and Adams and Jefferson, who were almost like deified. Jackson, on the other hand, was portrayed much more as a person that people could relate to. And for that reason, Jackson wins the 1828 election pretty handily, right? Pretty handily, Jackson wins. Now, when Jackson comes to office, here's a guy who is being described by kind of the old political guard as a barbarian. In fact, somebody who was there at Andrew Jackson's inauguration when he was sworn into office said, this is what it must have been like when the barbarians had taken over Rome. So there's a political change taking place where, the voice of the common person, so to speak, is being heard and now holds power. So as you might assume, it's not too, it doesn't take too long before scandals emerge in the presidency. One has to do with appointed political positions. So when Andrew Jackson got into office, he essentially fired 50% of those positions. We call this the rotation in office, getting rid of people who had been appointed previously and getting your guys in. Jackson then staffed the federal government with people who were loyal to him, right? Loyalty over ability. And the idea is that Jackson wanted people who he can trust, not necessarily who was the best for the job. And this, of course, came with a lot of controversy and scandal because a lot of the people who were loyal to Andrew Jackson also were corrupt. Right, so there's a lot of corruption going on. So number one, this new guard coming in, Jackson just gets rid of everybody who he doesn't trust and brings in only people who he can trust. So that's scandal number one. Scandal number two also kind of reveals a little bit into the, it provides a little bit of a window into elite politics of the time, and that was the petticoat affair. This involved or was centered around a woman, Margaret Peggy O'Neill, who had previously been married and had 3 children. Her husband committed suicide. There were rumors about her infidelity, that she was seeing other elite men in the Washington, D.C. area. And when her husband committed suicide, then speculation ran afoul that it was because of her actions and kind of her infidelity, that was the reason why it happened. She then married another prominent Washington individual called Mr. Eaton. And her new marriage to Mr. Eaton then created a division within politics. John C. Calhoun, and especially her wife, believed that Peggy O'Neill was not somebody to be associated with. John C. Calhoun was actually Andrew Jackson's vice president. And she disavowed O'Neill and Eaton, whereas Jackson supported Peggy O'Neill and Mr. Eaton. And so this was like, it's almost like, a popularity contest in like high school or something like that. I'm not going to be friends with you. Calhoun and other elites refused to be friends with O'Neill and Eaton, and Jackson and Martin Van Buren instead did. And so Jackson, instead of, really consulting his appointed cabinet, which consisted of people like Calhoun and Jackson, there's going to be a split. We'll talk maybe a little bit more about this, but, Jackson and Calhoun split, and instead Jackson favors Van Buren. And Van Buren and all of those friends, right, this category, they just called him the kitchen cabinet because it wasn't really the formal cabinet of insiders that Andrew Jackson could potentially talk to and consult whenever he needed. So there was a lot of shaking up in Washington, D.C. when Andrew Jackson was inaugurated as president.